they needed bigger accelerators. And thus 14 years after their first joint announcement, Burton Richter and Samuel Ting will be reunited. Not for the first time. They had, after all, jointly accepted a Nobel Prize some years back. And yet, despite the prestige of the Nobel ceremony, this occasion was no less monumental. A few feet away from them, the announcement is being made for what will be the largest scientific undertaking in United States history. It would be the particle physics equivalent of landing on the moon. Their mission was to find the holy grail of particle physics. And Ronald Reagan was all in.
Outer space used to be called the final frontier. But today we've begun to tap another frontier, inner space, whose infinitesimal constellations hold out infinite possibilities. I know that some people may question the practical applications of the superconducting super collider, but the truth is, the practical applications of this knowledge are already changing the way we live. In the face of ever-increasing global competition, the United States must maintain the leading edge in science and technology, and building the world's largest particle accelerator is a visible symbol of our nation's determination to stay out front.
Lost New Hampshire Medicaid?
Where can we find a low-cost health plan?
What about a plan that covers doctor visits?
Emergency care?
Healthcare.gov is here for you. Enroll today for coverage starting next month.
Within 5 years, the project was completely collapsed. And with it, American leadership in the realm of particle physics. Burton Richter would go on to call the project one of high-energy physics' greatest failures. I'm warning you now. This story has a lot of things. What it doesn't have is a happy ending. This was a failure so big, so massive in its scope, that it's hard to put into words. Instead, I think it's better if I let you see for yourself. If I gave you a rock and asked you to describe what the inside of it looked like with no access to fancy tools, what would you do? Personally, I'd throw it at the ground repeatedly until it broke. At some point, humans realize that the best way to find out what something is made of is to smash it open. And if it's a rock or an apple, our hands can get the job done. But if we wanted to break apart something small, like a proton, for instance, we're going to need some specialized gear. Hence, particle accelerators. A particle accelerator, or more specifically a collider, consists of three main components. One, a tunnel system, generally a circular loop that is held at vacuum and at temperatures close to absolute zero. This is what the particles will be traveling through. Two, a set of ultra-strong magnets. These serve two purposes. Most of the ring is surrounded by equally spaced magnets, and their job is to steer the charged particles around the ring. Additionally, you have a specific region where the magnets are used to speed up the particles once per loop. Like a booster in Mario Kart. After thousands of loops per second, the particle has approached the speed of light. And finally, 3. The collision zone. This region usually contains an advanced detector that gathers hundreds of gigabytes of data per second. Think blood splatter analysis, only real. Modern accelerators are typically built in several stages, with linear injecting segments, multiple booster sections, etc., like the incremental stages of a rocket. But by and large, accelerators are just big guns we build underground, and then we shoot really tiny bullets, and then we hope that the bullets ram into each other and explode. Why? Because collisions release a ton of energy, and energy is related to mass through Einstein's iconic equation, E = mc². So, if you want to generate heavier quarks, we need larger energies and larger machines. And for the past 2 decades, one nation has been the undisputed world champion when it comes to building accelerators. Throughout the 60s and 70s, 5 quarks and 2 leptons were discovered in the United States, the fruits of the November Revolution. At the turn of the 1980s, the US was operating 4 major accelerator labs. You had SLAC over in California, where we met our buddy Richter, and you had Brookhaven in New York with our buddy Ting. You also had Cornell, a little ways away in Ithaca. But the newest and shiniest was the crown jewel of America's particle accelerators, the Tevatron, located at Fermilab in the outskirts of the windy city of Chicago. The Tevatron name is an amalgamation of 2 things. 1. TeV is short for tera electron volts, or a trillion electron volts. That's the approximate collision energy the machine is capable of generating. And the other half tron, because it's very funny to name expensive scientific instruments with the suffix tron. With a loop diameter of 2 kilometers and state-of-the-art superconducting magnets, the Tevatron was the world's first collider to break the energy barrier from GeV to TeV. That was the true final frontier. As the standard model began to get filled in, the missing puzzle pieces were beginning to take shape. That meant the top quark, the W and Z bosons, and maybe, just maybe, the Higgs boson. The United States and its highly decorated army of physicists wanted to be the ones to plant down that flag. Bring home that W. Now consider how many accelerators existed in the rest of the world. In Western Europe you had CERN, straddling the French and Swiss borders, and then also DESI in Germany. The Soviet Union had 2 accelerators all to themselves. And finally, the rookies on the scene, you had Japan with their Keck Accelerator Lab. You may have noticed here that the US has almost half of the world's major accelerators. And for a while that was a major strength of the Americans. But as the 1980s rolled around, this was turning into a weakness. See, the US budget for particle physics had to be split between 4 labs that varied in size, age, and capabilities. To keep each of them competitive would require multiple ongoing upgrades that would spread the slim budget even slimmer. The fear was that Europe's consolidation into one entity, CERN, would allow them to pool all their resources and take the lead. CERN was already digging a tunnel for its newest collider, the Large Electron Positron Collider, or LEP. With a diameter of 8.6 kilometers, it would be by far the world's largest, making Fermilab's 2 kilometers look quaint. To maintain their competitive edge, US physicists would have to one-up CERN. Instead of 4 small labs competing for funding, the path forward should be one new, giant lab. All their eggs in one basket. Throughout the 70s, there were conferences held over and over again with dreams of a VBA, or Very Big Accelerator. That name was coined by Leon Lederman, then the director of Fermilab and the leader of the team that had discovered the bottom quark. Generally considered to be the godfather of this hypothetical new accelerator, he would become the project's biggest cheerleader in the years to come. But concrete plans wouldn't materialize until 1982 at a conference in Snowmass, Colorado. Lederman again led the charge, calling for a new gargantuan American collider that would be able to support energies as high as 40 TeV with a loop diameter of 30 kilometers or higher. This was an absurdly high energy and a massive footprint to go along with it, and thus would require an enormous location to build it in, something flat and empty. The hypothetical machine was therefore nicknamed the Desertron. A year later, in 1983, CERN announced the discovery of the W and Z bosons. There were no buts about it, Europe had taken the lead in the boson race. With the pressure mounting even further, a government-sponsored panel was organized and the American project got its official name, the SSC, or the Superconducting Super Collider. A machine so grand and ostentatious, its name included the word super twice. Rough estimates peg the cost of such a machine at somewhere between 4 to 8 billion in 2021 US dollars. Now look, I get that 1 billion is a big number, so big that it's basically meaningless without a reference frame. So I've assembled a few comparisons. The taller the height, the more expensive it is. We have the most expensive skyscraper ever built at 4 billion, the most expensive stadium ever built at 5.5 billion, and also the most expensive bridge at 7.5 billion. For a little mobile flavor, the most expensive plane is the B-2 stealth bomber at 2.43 billion, and the most expensive ship ever built was the USS Gerald R. Ford at 13 billion. For some scientific comparisons, we have the Mars rover at a humble 2.7 billion, the Human Genome Project at 5 billion, GPS satellites at 12 billion, and the Hubble telescope in at a hefty 13.5 billion. What about one of the largest American engineering projects of the 20th century, the Panama Canal? 19.7 billion. So overall, I don't think we're doing too bad, considering this thing may or may not unlock the secrets of the universe. But still, there was only one way they were going to pay for a machine that expensive: the American taxpayer. And to be clear, each of America's previous 4 colliders were paid for the same way, but each of these had a comparatively baby budget of a few $100 million. Look at them, little baby machines. Don't get me wrong, it's nothing to scoff at, that's a lot of money. But when it comes to taxpayer-funded projects, there is a big difference in a price tag that starts with an M versus a price tag that starts with a B. Not only that, these 4 colliders were built during a period of American history that was far more sympathetic to the whims of physicists. How do I put this? Ever since they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, the United States had supplanted itself ahead of Europe to become one of 2 global superpowers. And again, partially thanks to that very same atom bomb, America took the lead in another area: nuclear physics. Since World War II, nuclear and particle physicists have enjoyed a certain amount of privilege not afforded to other subfields in physics. With the successful completion of the Manhattan Project, which, by the way, clocked in at around 30 billion in today's money, it seemed only logical to create an organization that would manage any future research into nuclear weapons. I mean nuclear energy. That led to the creation of the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC. It was a confidential agency that had the luxury of operating largely out of the public eye, only having to answer to the Congressional Committee on Atomic Energy at meetings that were always held behind closed doors. For the most part, nuclear physicists were given a blank check to build powerful nuclear reactors and colliders on the pretense that their research was advancing national security. And particle physicists fell into 2 camps over this. On the one hand, you have the war hawks, people like Edward Teller and Harold Agnew, who actively championed the defense applications of nuclear research and were more than happy to enjoy the money they were being showered with. And on the other hand, you have the physicists who didn't much care for the war and weapons of mass destruction things, but they're happy to look the other way if it meant getting funding for their real passions. It's how the sausage got made, and no one was going to bite the hand that fed them. But this age of scientific free reign was about to change. The anti-war and anti-nuclear movement of the 60s led to harsh criticism of the AEC. It neglected radiation protections, reactor safety, and had a laissez-faire attitude when it came to environmental pollution. Congress was so fed up with the lack of oversight that they voted to abolish the AEC in 1974. The 1970s as a whole were a time of dramatic upheaval for America. It had been rocked by the Watergate scandal, and America's dominance in the automobile and electronics industries was waning, with Europe and Japan taking over. This, combined with unrest in the Middle East, had led to a global oil crisis, rampant inflation, and a massive recession. In response to this, President Jimmy Carter created a new department in 1977, the Department of Energy, or for short, the DOE. The DOE was organized to manage and fund research into a variety of programs, such as solar power, renewables, and synthetic fuels. Additionally, all nuclear responsibilities, peaceful or otherwise, were absorbed into the newly created department. No longer would their funding be automatically rubber-stamped. The DOE would be subject to the whims of Congress and the Public Subcommittee on Energy and Water Projects. The age of nuclear physicists always getting what they wanted was over. They'd have to compete for funding like every other subfield. So, as a first tentative step, the DOE approved a meager, I say meager in quotes here, $52 million to begin R&D in 1984. But if the SSC was going to turn that M into a B, they had to get some key people in Washington on board. They had to make a deal with the devil. The SSC only got off the ground due to an alliance of convenience. There had never before been a scientific project of this scope, both in the physical size and financial cost. Unlike previous American accelerators funded by the US government, this one was going to be the first to cross the $1 billion threshold. In fact, it was projected to cross it a dozen times, and as a consequence, it was not going to be able to be quietly funded without significant public scrutiny. In particular, it needed the stamp of approval of one very specific person. There are two Ronald Reagan quotes often associated with the SSC, both of which came following a cabinet meeting on January 29th of 1987. At the end, when Reagan finally gave his approval for the project, he was told that his decision would make a lot of physicists ecstatic. His reply was, "That's probably fair, because I made 2 physics teachers in high school very miserable." But the other quote gives a little more insight into Reagan's thought process. Following a presentation on the merits of funding the project, he reportedly pulled out an index card from his jacket pocket and went on to recite a poem by Jack London. "I would rather be ashes than dust." This continued on for about a minute. In a moment that is very on brand for late-stage Reagan, those in the room with him were unclear on what he was trying to say. Reagan would clarify with a different quote, which he pulled from his days spent as a football announcer. He was telling physicists to throw deep. It was time for a Hail Mary. It may be surprising to you that Ronald Reagan, of all people, would be so enthusiastic about a multi-billion-dollar project that is incredibly abstract and with almost no short-term economic or strategic benefits. But I think the line "throw deep" perfectly encapsulates Ronald Reagan's distinct brand of Cold War posturing. It took nearly 6 years of delicate political maneuvering by physicists and bureaucrats alike to get Reagan to throw deep with the SSC and the Department of Energy. It was like playing political whack-a-mole. Every time physicists would gain one ally in Washington, they'd either retire or get promoted, only to be replaced by someone who wasn't that much of a fan of the project. But eventually, they'd manage to sway several key members around the big man himself. First was George Keyworth, a nuclear physicist serving as Reagan's first science advisor. Eventually, he was joined by Alvin Trivelpiece, the director of energy research at the DOE. He did a lot of the legwork to eventually get the support of John Harrington, Secretary of Energy. And Harrington was finally high enough up the bureaucratic food chain to arrange that fateful cabinet meeting where Trivelpiece gave the pitch that ultimately swayed Reagan. All of this is especially remarkable, given that when Reagan first took office in 1981, one of his first acts was to try and shut the DOE down. During his presidential campaign, Reagan had actively made promises to do just that. The department was the exact kind of red tape, big government overreach he villainized through his politics. As soon as he took office, Reagan slashed programs left and right and began to dismantle the department. He cut all funding to the renewable energy and synthetic fuel programs, and in a particularly spiteful and petty act, he removed the solar panels Carter had installed on the White House roof. You can see just how little Reagan cared about the department by looking at who he chose to run it. Throughout Reagan's 8 years in office, he would appoint 3 secretaries of energy, each of whom was uniquely unqualified. His first pick was a dentist-turned-politician. His next choice, Donald Hodel, was closer, as an ex-power grid administrator. And yet, he's most remembered for his proposed solution to the hole in the ozone layer, which was not to try and fix it, but rather suggesting that everyone just wear hats and sunscreen. His final secretary was John Harrington, a California real estate developer. Perfect. Now, hindsight has painted Reagan as anti-science, but I think this is a misconception. Reagan could be pro-science. After some small cuts in his first year in office, there was an immediate reversal. Funding for federal research and development grew by a whopping 50%. But of course, this came with a big, fat asterisk. Reagan was funding a very specific kind of science. As you might be aware, the Department of Energy is still around today. Reagan never went through with completely gutting it. And it's likely because once he took office, he realized the department's true purpose. The DOE handles the country's nukes. So of course, under Reagan, while almost everything in the DOE was cut, the nuclear energy and nuclear weapons programs received massive increases. But let's visualize this another way. See those mountains back there? Well, they aren't actually mountains. They're the annual United States military budget. Now obviously this is on a different vertical scale than our collider here. If I put them on the same scale, everything would be so squashed as to be useless. It's mostly for the aesthetic, but also to give you a sense of the evolving priorities of the US government. The Reagan bump, or Mount Gipper as I like to call it, is staggering when compared to the administrations that came immediately before and after it. Reagan oversaw the largest peacetime buildup in US military history. Reagan was intent on winning the Cold War, and his strategy was to outspend the Soviets in every area they could. And while most of this new funding was going towards personnel and equipment, an ever-increasing amount of it was going towards a new generation of high-tech weapon systems. Before Reagan, if you broke down all R&D funding in terms of civilian and military comes in at just 47%. Under Reagan, those digits just straight up swapped up to a whopping 74%. 3/4 of all R&D funding was now being used exclusively for military purposes. Take it from Reagan's science advisor, George Keyworth. Those areas that are most exciting and those most necessary to the economy or national defense should be supported at a higher level than areas that are dormant. Thankfully, for particle physicists, there was an upside. One of the exciting areas Keyworth was referring to was the search for the W and Z bosons over in Europe. Despite Reagan's priorities being defense, he was also a firm believer that the government had the responsibility to fund basic research. That meant low-level physics and chemistry. Recognizing that even though there was no short-term applications, many years down the line the research would prove to be essential. For that reason, and also the influence of Alvin Trivelpiece, funding for energy research rose by 80% under Reagan. If a few Americans could win some Nobel Prizes, hey, that'd be a nice bonus. Other fields of science were not so lucky, and they began to resent nuclear physics as the teacher's pet of the US government. Less flashy areas such as condensed matter physics, renewable energy, medicine saw their budgets stagnate due to inflation, or in the worst cases, receive deep cuts. In the eyes of the Reagan admin, they were too application heavy. Those areas should be the responsibility of private industry, the invisible hand of the glorious free market. And of course, you can't discuss Reagan underfunding science without addressing his callous indifference to the AIDS crisis, which led to millions of unnecessary deaths. After years of protests and criticism from gay rights activists and epidemiologists, Reagan would reluctantly appoint a commission to deal with the AIDS crisis in 1987. Of course, in a very Reagan move, he selected Admiral James D. Watkins to be in charge of the committee. Once top dog of the Navy, his appointment was widely criticized, questioned even by Watkins himself. He was, after all, a devout Catholic who supported the military's ban on gay service members. Despite what you might expect, Watkins took his job seriously, advocating for $50 million in funding for research, improved sexual health education, and he criticized religious bigots who considered the disease an act of God. In his commission report, he would go on to request anti-discrimination laws for those suffering from AIDS. The commission report passed by a slim vote of 7-6. Reagan would go on to ignore most of the suggestions made by Watkins. Although he didn't say so publicly, behind the scenes, Watkins was said to have been angered and depressed. But there is only one thing that Reagan loved more than the amount that he hated the gays: space. Throughout the 80s, NASA's budget was either stagnant or marginally declining. But in actuality, Reagan was pumping plenty of money into space tech. It was just going to a different department, the Department of Defense. See, NASA is explicitly for non-military space applications. Military space funding simply falls under the classified umbrella of the Air Force, and its space division far outpaced the budget of NASA. When it came to space projects, Reagan had a knack for betting on overambitious ideas that hemorrhaged money and never saw the light of day. For example, during Reagan's 1984 State of the Union address, where he said the words free and freedom 25 times, he announced that he was directing NASA to build the ludicrously named Space Station Freedom. This bloated project was intended to be a peaceful, civilian-based orbiting research lab until the Department of Defense began encroaching, demanding that it could, at any point, carry out national security work on the station, unvetted and without the permission of any other nation sharing the station. Indeed, any partner nations would not be allowed to, and I quote here, displace either the reality or symbol of US leadership. Would it surprise you that other nations were reluctant to join on to the project? Ultimately, the bloated plan was never able to get off the ground. It underwent nearly 7 redesigns and scalebacks before ultimately being scrapped in 1993. Another of these pipe dreams was the so-called Orient Express spaceplane, a hypersonic plane that could take off and land at regular airports, but which could also deliver satellites into space. After spending around $3 billion, the project was canned in 1994, and the technology was considered unworkable. But of all of Reagan's failed Cold War babies, the most ridiculous of all of these was an outer space, laser-based missile defense system that was nicknamed Star Wars. It never saw the light of day because it relied on a magical X-ray laser technology that hadn't been invented yet. It still hasn't been invented yet. The missile defense system was pure science fiction, but Reagan was so enamored with the idea that his obsession killed the 1986 nuclear disarmament talks with Gorbachev. Ronnie loved his sci-fi space lasers so much that he walked away from what could have been the effective end of the Cold War. Throughout its life cycle, Star Wars wasted nearly $60 billion over 10 years before being scrapped completely. But, to hear it from Reagan's top generals, these colossal wastes of money weren't entirely wastes of time. See, these lofty science fiction projects may have been unattainable in hindsight, but so long as the USSR thought they were even remotely possible, the Soviets would continue to sink billions of dollars they didn't have into trying to keep pace with the Americans, hopefully one day bankrupting them. And, to a certain extent, money troubles did lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But on the other hand, this relentless defense buildup led to a massive deficit that would follow the US into the next two administrations. So, with all this context, it should be obvious now why Reagan was so eager to support the SSC. George Keyworth knew that Reagan had a personal investment in projects that appeared imaginative and ambitious, and thus worked hard to pitch the SSC in the same light as projects like Star Wars. But whereas those projects helped to probe the frontier of outer space, the SSC would probe the opposite end of the spectrum, inner space. And when I use the term frontier, that's not me clumsily adding subtext. It was the specific language used by many physicists to help sell the SSC as a way to reassert American dominance. To give you a sense of how the government viewed the SSC, Secretary Harrington stated that the SSC would be the high-energy physics equivalent of putting a man on the moon. And in a lot of ways, the SSC truly was like putting a man on the moon. For one, the US did not win the space race. Let's get that out of the way. They were beaten by the Soviet Union to every conceivable milestone. It was only by choosing a grand and ostentatious goal with a high chance of failure that the US was able to move the goalposts and reshape the narrative that they won the space race. This was an approach typical of US government-funded science. Bold, big advancements where they would leapfrog over the competition. And whereas they competed with the Soviet Union when it came to space, their rival in the realm of particle physics was Western Europe. American projects aimed for the stars, designing riskier, bigger machines that were miles ahead of the slower, less ambitious, and meticulously engineered European counterparts. Europe's accelerators were far more likely to work on their first attempt, but that slower process meant that throughout the 60s and 70s, the US had beat them to many important breakthroughs. The SSC was very much following in this template, a bold leap forward in terms of both max energy and size. But it was also very risky. Years of R&D would be required for magnets, a massive empty location with stable geology that could handle years of tunneling. It was a massive gamble, but it was the kind of gamble that Reagan loved to make. In 1987, in a last-ditch effort, the director of CERN, Herbert Schopper, testified in front of Congress and argued that the US should abandon the SSC and join up with Europe. They were in the early stages of construction on their newest collider, the LEP. He argued that there was significant overlap between the two machines. Even better, they were specifically making the tunnels large enough so that if they wanted to upgrade 10 years down the line, then they could, easily. But, despite this open invitation, or maybe even because of it, the Reagan admin barreled forward. America would regain its dominance in particle physics with or without the Europeans. So with Reagan's endorsement, R&D funding could shift into high gear. Now, there were concerns within the academic community that marketing the machine as a symbol of American supremacy could deter other countries from participating in the construction. However, most seemed to understand the reality that this was the price they had to pay to get Reagan on board. This will absolutely not come back to haunt the project in any way, shape, or form. At all. Meet Maury Tigner. Maury has been toiling away in the background of the story for a while now. When the DOE approved an initial research phase for the SSC in 1984, Maury was picked to lead the planning team out of Berkeley, California. He was widely viewed among the community as one of the brightest minds in accelerator design, having been responsible for Cornell's accelerator. The DOE was impressed with Tigner's efficiency and thoroughness, and also by how he inspired loyalty in his team. He worked hard, and his team respected him. And in a field with so many conflicted voices, the DOE viewed him as the only suitable candidate to become the full-time leader of the R&D. With the plan laid out, the DOE allocated a few dozen million in funding, a small enough amount that Congress didn't have to be consulted. Like I mentioned previously, accelerators are really just three components: a tunnel system, thousands of ultra-strong magnets, and a series of detectors. The detectors, thankfully, could come much later in the project's life. The key criteria that needed to be figured out were A, how big is the tunnel loop going to be, and B, how are they going to make the magnets? Collider performance is really a three-way compromise between the size, max energy, and magnet strength. Ideally, we'd make the loop as small as we could, because tunneling and construction is incredibly expensive. But at the same time, if we want a smaller loop, we need stronger magnets to compensate. And magnets aren't cheap either. And these weren't just any magnets. They were going to be 17-meter-long superconducting niobium titanium magnets, which meant that to maximize their performance, they would need to be held at temperatures barely above absolute zero. If they rise in temperature too much, just 4 degrees above absolute zero, the magnets quench and lose their superconductivity. This is usually followed by a rapid surge of heat that can melt components or even cause an explosion. For all these reasons, each magnet would likely cost around tens of thousands of dollars, and they'd need around 8,000 of them. So, to summarize, if you lock in max energy and you lock in magnet strength, the size of the collider is really the only variable they could increase. Somewhere in the middle of all this was the sweet spot, and Maury Tigner's team needed to find it. In early 1984, there were reports from CERN that evidence of the top quark had been found. This turned out not to be the case, but the false alarm still put pressure on the design team. CERN kept bragging that their eventual upgrade could support energies up to 18 TeV. The SSC needed to go above and beyond to justify its existence. So, for both technical and political reasons, Tigner's group decided on a colossal total energy of 40 TeV. The loop would have a diameter of 30 kilometers, nearly 3 times as big as CERN's. If predictions were correct, the SSC would absolutely find the top quark, and hopefully the Higgs boson as well. They estimated a 9-year project length, 3 for full R&D, and 6 for construction. The new estimate for the costs was updated to 7.5 to 8.3 billion. On the higher end, but certainly not outrageous. After soliciting a number of different magnet proposals that varied in shape, materials, and strength, they settled on a magnet that could operate at 6.6 Teslas, powered by nearly 12,000 amps of current. This magnet won out over a design by a group in Texas, who had a cheaper but weaker magnet. The choice ultimately came down to the size of the collider. If they went with Texas's magnet, the loop's diameter would be nearly double in size, making the whole thing prohibitively expensive. But here's where the drama comes in. The Texas group refused to accept this decision, saying that there was no way the R&D team could meet their deadlines with the other designs. Now, whether the design would have been any better, we can't really say, but they were right when they predicted that Tigner and his team wouldn't be able to meet their deadlines. The prototypes were a mess, way over budget and behind schedule by over a year. The magnets consistently quenched before achieving their target strength of 6.6 Teslas. Basically, the fields are so strong that the magnets would literally tear themselves apart if not properly constrained, generating heat that ruined the superconductivity. Solving this problem took nearly a year of work that ate up much of the R&D budget. In the years since the SSC was first conceived, its estimated cost had ballooned significantly. In 1982, the most optimistic estimates were saying around $4 billion. When R&D began in 1984, better estimates said $8 billion. Factoring in magnet delays, $10.7 billion. Now, by 1988, numbers as high as $14.1 billion were being thrown around. It had doubled in cost since the DOE first approved the project, all while the federal deficit had been growing wildly out of control. Congress was instituting tougher and tougher budget restrictions, and if they wanted construction funds, Congress was going to have to approve them. To stave off any cuts, Energy Secretary John Harrington made a vague promise that nearly 30 to 50% of the project funding would come from foreign partners. But as of yet, there have been no eager volunteers. Weird that other countries aren't so keen to sign on to a project marketed as an America First project with American leadership on American soil. I'm sure this definitely isn't an omen of things to come. So in the meantime, with no foreign partners, Congress denied funding to begin construction for 2 back-to-back years, instead only giving out $230 million for more R&D. The budget was growing, just not as much as physicists would have liked. Construction would have to wait for whoever the next president was going to be. Behind the scenes, the project had just narrowly avoided a disaster that could have stalled its momentum for years. The SSC hit its first major budget snag in spring 1988. Somehow, in a shockingly negligent oversight, the DOE had forgotten to request funding for the Location Search Task Force. During their travels across the country, the task force had racked up a bill of $19 million, which wasn't accounted for in the fiscal budget. And Tigner's boss, Wilmo Hess, who was in charge of the search committee, refused to go back to Congress and request more. Instead, he insisted that the $19 million be cut from the R&D team's $61 million, which put Maury Tigner in one of the worst positions imaginable. It was already halfway through the fiscal year, which meant that R&D had already committed funds to the magnet development, the purchasing of superconducting wire, and staff salaries. Can you guess which one the DOE wanted Tigner to cut? And when I mean cut, I actually mean lay off almost his entire staff. Tigner, as you might expect, refused to do that, since they were already behind schedule, but also because he'd be laying people off who had no jobs to go back to. Many of his employees had left comfy university positions to come work for him. Applying for funding for academic jobs is often a months-long process with no guarantee you'll be approved. If you let them go, he'd be screwing them over with no guarantee they'd even want to rejoin the project at a full year. Tensions reached their peak on a particularly nasty Friday the 13th. Wilmo Hess phoned him up and ordered him to deliver a list of names to fire that same day. Tigner reluctantly began making a list. Disaster was thankfully averted by lunch, when news came that the chairman of the Appropriations Committee had finally allowed the DOE to take the missing $19 million from elsewhere. Tigner held his ground, saved his employees, and likely a ton of momentum for the project. It was a small victory, but Tigner's refusal to give in to DOE orders had made him some enemies. When he first joined the project, he was viewed as a highly respected and competent academic. Now, he was labeled as someone who didn't follow orders, and that would have consequences in the coming months.